yeah, I don't know how knowledgeable you are about cooperatives at this point. So, I'm going to talk more to the audience because I assume that there are people in the audience who don't know much about cooperatives. So I'll just kind of lay out some basics of it just to make sure we're on the same page. Yeah, so in a cooperative, it's different than a normal corporation because instead of one share, one vote, it's one person, one vote. So it's more democratic because it doesn't matter how many shares you own. It's one person, one vote. So nobody has more power than anybody else unless they're like been elected to a position. The way that works is that there's two classes of shares. There's membership shares and then there's investment shares or preferred shares is what they're called. Sorry. So membership shares, you would just the people who belong to a class, like workers. It could either be workers, customers, or producers. Those are the three classes that could be members of a cooperative. Now, you can do multiple of those. You could combine like a worker and a consumer cooperative. So you could hypothetically have homeowners and cooks and gardeners all be members. That would be a multi-stakeholder cooperative. Now, you could do all three. Then it gets a little complicated, and there's always this question of, is there a conflict of interest? So like workers and customers might have some conflict of interest where they want different things. So you have to kind of think about that, and also think about numbers wise. Like I was on the board of directors of the Oklahoma Food Cooperative, and I at least felt like it was a problem that we elected most of the board members just by the whole membership, and yet it was a consumer and producer cooperative. There were way more consumers than producers, so the consumers had a lot more power in voting for the board than the producers did, even though the producers were actually more reliant on the cooperative for their living. Like they actually had more stake in it in a lot of ways. They had less power. So I feel like that created this kind of negative dynamic within the organization where like the people on the board like weren't really business savvy and that sort of thing. So you got to be careful about that sort of thing. And then so it's one member, one person, one vote, and then people can also buy these preferred shares that would give them extra profits, but not any extra decision making power. No extra votes, but you do get extra profits if you own more shares. But let me break that down for you. So the profits are split between these two, the preferred shares and the membership shares, and the way that works is that up to an 8% gain on the investments of the preferred shares. So let's say you had $1 million worth of preferred shares that are owned by people. You can only pay out up to 8% of $1 million to those people. Does that make sense?
In any year, do you mean?
In a year. Yeah. Yeah. And that's for tax purposes. Hypothetically, you could, but then you would lose the tax benefits of being a cooperative, which is like you can do pass through. You aren't double taxed as a cooperative. So there's a tax benefit there, but you don't get it if you pay out more profits than that 8%. So any additional profits over that 8% would be paid, or whatever the board decides. The board could decide to only pay out 5%. Whatever the board decides for that year, any additional profits would go to the members based on their patronage. So it's not how many shares they have, it's how much business they did with the cooperative in that year. So if you have worker cooperative, then like with this cooks and gardeners, however many members and however much work that those gardeners did, however much money they brought in for the cooperative or through the cooperative, that would determine what portion of that profit they get. So the workers that worked more that year would get more profit. Okay, if it was a consumer cooperative, it would be how much you bought in that year. So you'd have an account, you'd have to account for that. So this is one of the negative things about being a cooperative. You have to account for like each individual member's like purchases, you're counting for people's income anyway. You have to do that, but in a normal business, you don't have to account for each individual person's purchases. With a consumer cooperative, you do, so that you can pay out those profits. Like REI does that. So that's how the profit works. Now, decision making. So you've got this one person, one vote thing going on, but that's only for ownership decisions. It is not for day-to-day management decisions. It's only for decisions like who's on the board, should we issue more stock, should we dissolve the corporation, those kinds of decisions. There's very few decisions that are really made by the board at that level, or made by the membership at that level, because the board even makes other decisions like setting the yearly budget, like that kind of stuff. The board makes, you don't have to get a vote of the entire membership for that. To have a vote of the entire membership for something, it's like just voting for the board and like certain legal kind of decisions that are made at that ownership level. All other day-to-day decisions can be made any way you want. It could be consensus, it could be holacracy, it could be democracy, it could be hierarchy, whatever you want. It doesn't matter. Like legally with a cooperative structure, you can use any decision-making structure you want for operations. I think that's it. I think that's the basics.
That's the overview.
Yeah, that's the basics of how a cooperative works. So yeah, the question is this just a worker cooperative? That seems like that's what you've decided so far. Does that sound like the way you want to go?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's the way I have visualized it. Although,
Okay.
it doesn't. That's not cast in concrete anywhere either.
Sure.
Because if we had a group of gardeners deciding to go forward with the structuring, then they could have an opinion different